Today's moderator, Desiree Reda. She's a research fellow and a doctoral researcher at the GIGA Institute for Latin America Studies, and she does research on security sector reform, state repression, social protest, amongst others, and her regional focus is on Central America. And Desiree, thanks for organizing this event today together with your fantastic colleagues and for moderating today's event, and happy to have you. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, David. Yes, also a warm welcome from my side to today's GIGA Forum, which I actually co-organized with my colleague Marcella, who's also here on the call, on the panel today. Yeah, as David already mentioned, I'm a research fellow and a doctoral student at the GIGA and also at the Center for Conflict Studies in Marburg. I work on working on state violence, on repression, on dissent and autocratizing context in Central America. I'm constantly reminded of the disproportionate dangers women are exposed to in the form of gender-based violence. For example, as effects of state violence, but also as effect of violent actors, violent non-state actors. Therefore, I'm very pleased that we are discussing this topic here today, that we have so amazing guests on the panel. And just mentioning that today, it's 2 days before the International Women's Day, and I think it's a very timely and important topic. According to the UN, gender-based violence can be defined as acts that inflict physical, mental, sexual harm or suffering, threats such as coercion and other deprivation of liberty. Another definition also of the UN is a bit broader and defines gender-based violence as traditional attitudes by which women are regarded as subordinate to men. They also include stereotyped roles which perpetuate widespread practices involving violence or coercion, such as family violence and abuse. Further, forced marriage, dowry death, acid attacks, and female circumcision are included in the term gender-based violence. As such, gender-based violence can take numerous forms, as we mentioned, intimate partner violence, sexual violence, child marriage, female genital mutilation, trafficking for sexual exploitation, other crimes, and so on. We will discuss this broader during the panel. It's important to note, maybe as a side note, not only women can be victims of gender-based violence, of course, but statistically, especially women and LGBTQI people are affected by this form of violence. In general, it can be said that gender-based violence is a global problem of epidemic proportions. Globally, an estimated 736 million women above the age of 15 have been subjected to physical and/or sexual intimate partner violence or non-partner violence, or both at least once in their lifetime. 200 million women have experienced female genital mutilation, and the UN registered in 2022 89,000 cases of intentional killings of women or girls worldwide. Violence against women and girls happens everywhere, and regardless of race, social situation, or economic earnings, women and girls can be affected. So it's quite clear that gender-based violence is a comprehensive and unfortunately still very topical problem of our time, which exists in various forms all over the world. Together with our guests, we would like to discuss today which forms of violence are prevalent where, what are the causes, but above all, what solutions exist and what is or can be done in a targeted manner. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished guests and experts today. First of all, I now see Carlo Koos. He's an associate professor of political science in the Department of Government at the University of Bergen in Norway. Before his academic career, he was a humanitarian aid worker with Doctors Without Borders in South Sudan, Libya, Egypt, Swaziland, and Uganda. His current research interests lie in how experiences of war, conflict, and risk shape social and political attitudes and behaviors. In addition to his academic work, he advises various international and non-governmental organizations on applied impact evaluations on questions of human rights and gender equality. Thank you for being here, Carlo. Next, I see Dr. Juliet Sulfer. She is a Marie Curie Research Fellow at Oxford and at the University of Mexico. Her work investigates women's high-risk leadership in Latin America with a focus on Mexico, El Salvador, and Colombia. She has extensive research and practitioner experience along the Colombian-Venezuelan border, where she supported Ladysmith Casas de Mujeres gender data project with vulnerable women. She earned her PhD in sociology from the University of Oxford in 2018. From 2024 onwards, she will be a Wahlberg Academy Fellow at the Swedish Defense University, where she will research feminist responses to patriarchal backlash in Latin America. Welcome, Julia. Who I don't see now anymore. I hope you're still there. Please welcome with me also Elizabeth Ngari. She's a member of various national and international human rights networks. She's a founding member, activist, and coordinator of the work of Women in Exile. Women in Exile is a civil society organization founded in 2020 in Brandenburg, Germany, with the purpose of fighting for the rights of refugee women. As an activist, Elizabeth focuses on training and empowering refugee women nationwide. She advocates for their rights, climate justice, and intersectional solidarity in women's rights. And last but not least, I would like to introduce my colleague, Marcela Villalobos. She's a researcher, activist, and human rights defender. Currently, she is a PhD candidate in political and social science at the National Autonomous University of Mexico and a visiting doctoral researcher here with us at GIGA. Her doctoral thesis engages with the topic of disappeared girls and women in the context of war on drugs in Mexico. Besides her academic work, she works with Amnesty International and presently forms part of its board of directors. As a human rights defender, Marcela works on issues of militarization of public security and disappearances. She supports families of forcefully displaced persons and advocates against violence against women in Mexico. So as you can see, we have a very exciting mix of academics and practitioners on the podium today. I cannot see Elizabeth yet. I hope she is there or joins us later. We had some technical issues before, so I hope we can welcome her later here. And of course, I also want to welcome all of you, all the guests who are listening to us now. And I warmly invite you to engage in discussion. You cannot unmute yourselves or turn on your videos, but you can post questions anytime in the chat using the chat function. I will take note of those questions, and I will try to include them whenever they fit, but especially in the second part of the discussion. Please also always indicate who your question is addressed to, so we know who to ask, who you would like to engage with. And I think my colleague also already wrote in the chat, so you can see where you find the chat function. Yes, so let's start. Well, what are we actually talking about? I introduced it a little bit in my brief introduction before, but I would like to know, maybe Carlo, you can extend a little bit, what do we know about gender-based violence against women and men?
Yeah, so I think I need to share a little bit background. Part of my research is addressing violence against women and men that is gender-based and sexual in context of conflict. So my research experience broadly focuses on countries that have experienced civil wars or civil war-like situations and are affected by armed conflicts, where governments fight against rebels, or where non-state armed groups fight against each other, and where civilians, but also combatants, are targets and experience not only fatal violence, but also other non-fatal forms of violence. And among these forms of non-fatal violence, sexual violence is actually quite widespread across the world. So there has been a lot of research in the past 10 years, in particular, that has shown the extent of sexual violence in different types of conflicts, and I think has also contributed to really change how we think about it. So, for instance, one of the main figures in this literature are Elizabeth Wood and Dara Cohen, and through both qualitative research but also through quantitative research, they have shown to what extent the presence of sexual violence in wars varies, actually. So there are conflicts where really any sexual violence or gender-based violence is perpetrated against civilians, but then there are also conflicts where a lot of violence happens. And even within the same conflict, some groups are more restraining, while other armed groups use sexual violence more extensively. So I think this is one of the really important findings that has also advanced the literature on sexual and gender-based violence, especially in countries that are affected by conflict. And when I talk countries affected by conflict, this is quite a large number of people in the world that are living in fragile and conflict-affected environments. So the International Committee of the Red Cross, so one of the, I would say, main authorities when it comes to emergency situations, has estimated a few years ago that a quarter of the world's population live in fragile and conflict-affected contexts and are at risk of violence. So that means like basically 1 billion women and girls, 1 billion women, 1 billion men and boys. But it just gives you a sense of the extensiveness of this type of violence.
Thank you, Carlo. You've just mentioned the conflict settings in which women are especially affected by violence, or where gender violence often occurs. Can you tell us a little bit more about the statistics that you also mentioned, that it's quite difficult to obtain numbers, but also to really rely on those numbers?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, even in countries in the global north that are relatively stable, so to speak, right? Statistics on sexual violence and also intimate partner violence in general. So what we assume to be violence, usually by a husband towards his wife. These figures are, of course, just reported violence, right? So many people do not want to report it. Many people don't know where to report it. Many people feel stigmatized, afraid, and so on and so on. And this gets even more difficult in places where the political institutions, like the police, hospitals, and so on, right, do not have a high level of legitimacy in the perception of the people. So we know very little about that, right? There are, of course, estimated figures by the United Nations when there is a peacekeeping mission and so on. But again, these are only reported levels of violence. So we have done research over the past 6 years together with colleagues, where we tried to get a sense of that. And I mean, there have been psychological studies in many of these countries, in many post-conflict countries like Liberia, DR Congo, and others. But the problem again is, like, if you ask people in surveys, have you experienced rape, right, in the past 12 months or in your lifetime, you face the same problem again. I mean, you approach people like a random sample and talk to them, but again, it's a situation where I as a survivor, as a victim, may not want to share that with an interviewer that is not known to me, right? And even if he or she is known, I may in particular not want to share it. So what we did is we tried a measure that gives the respondent almost full anonymity, right? So to give them to allow them to share, at least to get a better estimate of the extent of sexual violence. And we did this in Liberia, in DR Congo, in the eastern regions, and in Sri Lanka. So all post-conflict and conflict-affected places. And well, it's always hard to say, okay, what is the prevalence of sexual violence for a specific time period? You have to consider that some people also die during a particular period, right? So it's always, we never really know what is the real prevalence. But what we've seen is that giving people anonymity compared to a way of asking people directly, the reporting rate more than doubles, right? So what we've seen in all of these cases is that between 12 and 15% have experienced sexual violence perpetrated by either non-state armed forces or by the security forces in Sri Lanka, in DR Congo, and in Liberia, compared to just half of that when you ask people directly, right? So it just gives you a sense that you need this sense of anonymity, and this gives also, I think that's the policy implication of that, is to give organizations that want to provide support to survivors a better understanding where they want to focus this support on, right? Because resources in humanitarian settings are usually very limited. So you cannot spread this everywhere, right? So you need to focus on where.
Yeah. Thank you, Carlo. Maybe we can talk a little bit more about this towards the later part of the panel discussion when we talk about the solutions as well, and why those numbers are important to design solutions. You have not just mentioned that in war and conflict settings, sexual violence is predominant. At the same time, we see that in Latin America, especially, the term femicide was coined, and that also in contexts where we do not have war context, whether it's conflict context or not is often disputed. That's another discussion, but maybe partly relates. And the term femicide defines murder of women because of their gender. But at the same time, also we see a lot of forced disappearances in that country as well, in that region as well, I'm sorry, which is more known, at least, as in other regions of the world. Julia, could you please comment on the forms and peculiarities of violence against women in the region of Latin America?
Sure. Thank you so much, Desiree. I mean, that's a big order in the sense that, you know, Carlo has just focused on conflict-related sexual violence, which absolutely is one of the metrics we can look at when we're understanding these kinds of violences. Sorry. And so we can see, as I said, conflict-related sexual violence and rape in, for example, conflict countries like Colombia, where I've worked for years. We can also see that different forms of conflict-related violences are gendered. So if you look, for example, in Colombia at the rates of displacement in the context of the armed conflict, there are more women who have been displaced, partially because they've lost partners in terms of their partners have been killed or disappeared. And we know that then they have to go to other places, taking care of children, ensuring that they can have food and shelter and clothing for their dependents, often in marginalized neighborhoods where there are different sources of violence. We can also see outside of those more traditional conflict settings in places like El Salvador, where I work, Guatemala, Honduras, Venezuela, Mexico, where we see different forms of insecurity, chronic insecurity, that these can have repercussions on women. So beyond having high rates of intimate partner violence, as Carlo mentioned, you also see the impact of militarization or authoritarianism spilling over against women and girls in these contexts. And I'm sure that Marcela can speak much more comprehensively about the Mexican case, although I do a lot of work here with Madres Buscadoras, the women who are looking for their missing and murdered sons and daughters around the country, and the violence that even as searchers themselves, as mothers who are out searching, the kind of violences that they face. And we'll see on Friday at the big march here in Mexico City, where I'm based, that not only are the feminists out marching, but also so are the mothers of the victims of femicide. So are the mothers of missing and murdered sons and daughters and family members, because they also are threatened with gendered types of violences. We can also see, for example, in countries like El Salvador, that beyond intimate partner violence, there's also the impact of gangs and organized crime on women and girls, also the LGBTIQ+ population. This has to do in large part because of gendered norms, which establish really traditional divisions around what women are supposed to do and what men are supposed to do, seeing men and women as categories on a binary scale. And often, in many cases, women are viewed as property that live in and inhabit these territories that gangs, armed groups, organized crime members are seeking to dominate and control. And so the women who live there, their bodies are also seen as territories to be controlled. I work a lot doing asylum cases for people who are seeking asylum in the United States and different European countries. And one of the very frequent cases that I end up writing expert witness reports for out of El Salvador is these forced gang girlfriends, women who just as a kind of output of living in these neighborhoods impacted by chronic insecurity, get forced into, I say romantic in the loosest sense of the word, romantic relationships with gang members. I mean, I could go on, and I'm sure we'll have time to, but what I want to say is that gender-based violence is not only an intimate family issue, it's not only between men and women, it's very much a public problem. And it's public in the sense of the ways that government policies, government security policies, but also different elements of organized crime, different purveyors of violence around the world see and understand the role that women hold in society and choose to create violent relationships, both in public and private settings, around how women are able or not to act and how they're controlled. My background is in Latin America, but very much this applies beyond this continent. However, I'm happy to speak more about Latin America in the next questions.
Thank you so much, Julia, and also for mentioning, first of all, that this term intimate partner violence can be quite tricky, especially in the case of forced relationships, and also for pointing out and pointing towards the policies that influence or even foster violence against women. And maybe in this sense, we can, or looking at that, we can go deeper, looking at the case of Mexico. Marcela, maybe you can share a little bit about how the strategies of combating drug violence or combating drugs and narco trafficking affects women and creates the situation of forced disappearances.
Yes, thank you very much, Desiree, and it's I'm very happy to contribute along with Carlo, Elizabeth, and Julia. And yes, of course, like you were saying before, Latin America and the Caribbean are considered one of the most dangerous regions for being a woman. And also authorities in these countries have systematically failed to guarantee the rights of life, for freedom of being free of violence and discriminations for girls and women. So in Mexico particularly, only in the year 2022, over 3,700 women were victims of homicide, meaning an average 10 women every day. And I just cannot explain what is it, that number. 10 women every day are murdered in my country. And this figure has increased since the beginning of the so-called war on drugs, which started in 2006. And also the ways that the women are being killed also changed. Before it was more on the private spaces for a person that the victim knew. And since this war on drugs started, most women are killed now on the public space and with weapon. So around 30 years ago, this crisis on murders started to draw attention in northern Mexico, especially in Ciudad Juárez, as women were disappeared, sexually tortured, murdered, and their bodies were exposed in public spaces. And this situation had to happen so many times, so we are able to name the horror, in this case, to call this crime or hate crime as femicide or feminicide, because it is especially focused in gender-based violence. And of course, these cases, unfortunately, are accompanied by the impunity and the corruption, mostly remaining not only in Mexico, but in the region. And alongside this lethal violence, there are over 26,000 girls and women missing or registered as missing or disappeared in Mexico since 1984. But more than around 90% of them are women and girls that disappeared since the beginning of the war on drugs and the militarization of the public security. And between those girls and women disappear, around 44% are girls and teenagers between 0 and 19 years old. And this is important because it's different between male disappearing on the same ages, and that has to be with the felonies or the crimes that are related to the age, like torture or sexual exploitation, amongst others. So sometimes it's kind of hard to make statistics visible and try to explain the problem without actually understanding what's behind each number. And behind each number, there's a story. So I want to briefly tell you about Lupita. She was an elementary teacher school from a community in Guanajuato in central Mexico who disappeared in 2020. Her brother, Javier, found her on a mass grave, and from then on, he and his family decided to dedicate their lives to search for disappeared in the community, also in Guanajuato. Unfortunately, shortly after, Javier was murdered. So that led her father, Javier, and Maria, mother of Javier and Lupita, to actually displace from Guanajuato to Mexico City due to the violence on their community and the threats. And of course, it's hard to convey that this reality, that reality seems like so distant from here, and the experience of what the families of disappeared are actually going through in Mexico, and how they changed their lives, because it's mainly women that are searching for the loved ones. It's also accompanied by the indifference and the impunity of the state, that they had to change their lives in order to search for those 26,000 people disappeared in Mexico. 26,000 women in total, are more than 114,000 disappeared. So just to make a short closure, of course, this type of violence has to be studied in an intersectional perspective, because it's not only related to gender, but it's also girls and women that are being racialized, that are poor, lesbian, or transgender women, that affects them differently. And of course, because of their status, their context, are mostly common to remain in their cases in impunity, and might be forgotten by the authorities and the state. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Marcela, just very quickly, because I'm not sure if all of our guests are familiar with the terms, can you quickly explain the difference between femicide and feminicide, please?
Sure. So the difference started because of exactly feminicide. Femicide, it's what we could call the opposite of homicide, relating to men and women. But because of the the added context. Like, for example, it's not only that a person is, or a woman is being killed with a, let's say, with a weapon, but also that they are disappeared, they are victims of sexual violence, and after being raped or victim or tortured, they are their bodies are exposed. So this had to happen in order to actually say that this is a hate crime. So in a lot of countries in Latin America, the legislation had to change in order to visualize or visibilize the difference between a homicide or a feminicide in this case, focused on the killing of a woman because she's a woman, or gender-based violence especially. I hope that was clear.
Yes, thank you very much. I think that helps a lot for the general understanding. Just very briefly before we continue, unfortunately, I received note that our other guest, Elizabeth, has some technical issues and cannot participate actively. That's very sad. I'm really, really sorry to hear that. It would have been amazing to have you here, Elizabeth. I know that you're now in the guest section so that you're listening to us, and I want to encourage all of you to look at the webpage of Women in Exile, an organization that represents women that are exiled, especially in Germany, but in general, helps women that are affected by a double discrimination due to being exiled, being refugee women, and also being female and experiencing gender-based violence. So please check out the website of Women in Exile and their work. It's a very important work. Thank you so much for your activity, Elizabeth, and also for joining us in this way now. So we have just heard a lot about the different forms that of violence that we find in those contexts that you study. And also already a little bit about the perpetrators and causes. I would like to know a little bit more about the root causes of violence. Why do we experience or see so large numbers of violence against women, of gender-based violence in these conflict-affected contexts? Can you maybe tell us a little bit more about the violence in Mexico and El Salvador and Colombia, Julia, and what are the causes of this form of violence that you experienced there?
Sure. So I think, I already started to explain a little bit this idea of very traditional hierarchical gender roles. So what's acceptable in terms of the social construction of what's considered a man and what's considered a woman. Again, there's usually not much understanding of gender as existing on a sliding scale. So it's kind of, this traditional image of a man as virile, strong, brave, violent, and women as taking care of home duties, taking care of children, submissive. And these sorts of, images of what it means to be a man or what it means to be a woman are enacted out by different purveyors of violence. So I mentioned previously gangs, those involved in organized crime, also in many cases those involved in non-state armed groups. So my colleague, Dr. Kieran Stallone, and I just published a piece in the Journal on Peace Research, which looks at the gender nature of threats against social leaders in Colombia. And social leaders is a term that we use in Colombia generally to refer to human rights defenders, activists, those who are engaging in some sort of rights defense, be that women's rights, peace building, environmental rights, etc. And one of the things we found is that when, although men social leaders are killed at a much higher rate than women, when it comes to the types of threats that these actors receive, the threats are very gendered in nature. So what that means is that men are told that they're going to get killed. Men are told, for example, that they should, stop behaving in this way so that they can fulfill their roles as providers to their families. On the other hand, women are threatened with sexual violence against their children, and they're told, really importantly, to get out of the public space. They're told women's roles are not as public activists, participating in civil society politics, participating in more formal politics. Go home and take care of your kids. And this is a really gendered insight into how these different violent actors understand what men's and women's roles should be. In my own research, previous research in the book High Risk Feminism, I look at women peace builders and those who defend and make demands for gender justice throughout Colombia's peace process. I look at the ways that they receive threats and that they're targeted and have violence enacted against them, not only because they're these public figures, but also because they're women who are seen as transgressing these social roles or these social norms around what's acceptable for a woman. And so while these, my context and what I generally work on are these very visible leaders, human rights activists, human rights defenders, I think that what we can take from this is that in terms of some of these root causes of why women, be they in these more protagonistic roles, or kind of just general everyday women, are experiencing these multiple sources and forms of violence, in many ways can come down to these kind of patriarchal scaffoldings upon which many societies have been constructed, and the ways in which machismo, this very hegemonic understanding of gender roles, plays out across the region. Again, I'm speaking in very broad brushstrokes. This is not applying to everyone. There are differences when you look at different countries, different contexts, different forms of violence, different state formations. But generally speaking, that's one of the real sources when we think about why the numbers of women that we see are experiencing and surviving these violences. And just really quickly at the end, Carlo mentioned looking at rape statistics, for example, and he was saying why it's difficult for people to report them. Interestingly, if you look at statistics around men who have survived rape, they are always exceedingly low, if not nil. And that also fits into these gender norms. If a man is to be raped or to have suffered conflict-related sexual violence, that makes him less of a man. And so it's not that it's not happening, it's just an incredibly hidden phenomenon because people don't want to report it because, again, of these gender norms, which dictate the way that we understand what it is to be a legitimate man or woman in society. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Julia. Carla, maybe you want to come in there because you have this experience from getting those data and from trying to, as you mentioned before, in a very anonymized manner and with indirect questions, obtaining those data to get a more realistic number of gender-based violence as well affecting women as men. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit on that. And also I wanted to ask you, you mentioned before that the perpetrators in those contexts are, in most of the cases, the armed groups. So I was wondering, do all armed groups always engage in sexual violence? Does this mean in a war, there's always sexual violence from both sides? Can causes, scope conditions be identified that foster sexual violence in a war context?
Yeah, these are excellent questions, Desiree. And I mean, Julia already mentioned one of the central, I think, correlates, so to say, how we understand one of the roots, if you want to use that term, root causes of gender-based violence, of intimate partner violence, of sexual violence. I mean, these are all, I think, fueled from a similar societal norm that are sometimes present, right? Coming to your question about this data, right? So one thing that is, I think, very important to understand is that I think what we don't claim or want to claim is that these data represent the true prevalence of sexual violence for a given sample in a given period, right? Because it is really hard. You need to consider that there are people flee, that are displaced, people die who are not part of the sample. So in actuality, even the data that we estimated, I think, are closer to the truth than usually are in all these public health services that are being done, right? Like the demographic health service. These are implemented, like have been implemented for decades in dozens of countries of the global south, right? But I think that's where I think we need to change how we collect this data to better understand the extent of all of that. And once we have an understanding about the variation, right? So why do some women or men experience different forms of partner violence or sexual violence while others don't, right? Once we understand these correlations, then it's a little bit easier also to understand, okay, who are most at risk? And what we find is actually, what is quite interesting for some of the cases, that there isn't much of a difference between women's and men's experience of sexual violence. This is different for DR Congo, where women are much more likely to experience sexual violence. But you're right, in many of these places in conflict of war, there is this abnormally high risk of being subjected to sexual violence and other forms of violence against women by armed groups. But that doesn't mean that civilians and intimate partners don't perpetrate violence against women, right? That doesn't stop during war, right? That just continues. The violence from armed groups or organized crime groups, like in South America, that just comes on top of everything, right? So I think that's really important to understand. And I think there are some drivers of this type of violence that are very basic factors, like logistics. For instance, when women and girls have to fetch water, in many African areas, people don't have running water in their household, so they have to go to the nearest open water source. This can be a stream, a river, this can be a little pond. When these distances are very long, I mean, we know that, right? There is research on that. The risk of violence against women and girls is just much higher. Public lighting in streets is just one way to reduce it. So these are very simple logistical things that are correlated with that. Another thing is substance abuse by men. We know that this is correlated with intimate partner violence, not just in conflict places, but also in the global north. Poverty, distress, when Julia alluded to this idea about the heteronormative expectations, the man as provider of a safe environment, of providing for the family. If men in many of these areas don't feel they fulfill these expectations, that's stressful. And the closest person to take it out on is the partner and often the children, right? So these are, I think, coming from there, all these different angles, but I think these gender norms that Julia alluded to, I think they're particularly interesting, right? Because we often think that these gender norms, I mean, they don't exist by themselves, right? The gender norms are norms that everybody thinks about how others in my social reference group think about a certain topic. For instance, how I should behave as a man, or how I should behave as a man towards my wife, or the other way around, right? So, but we never really know that, right? Because nobody tells us, right? So we make these assumptions about these common social norms that are basically really influential for us, because we have a tendency, we want to be part of our social group, right? We don't necessarily want to transgress. Sometimes we want to, right? Sure. So we kind of informed by these social norms that we think others hold, but often we are completely wrong, right? So these wrong norms inform our attitudes and, as a consequence, behavior, and can lead to complete situations that are suboptimal, where nobody actually thinks that way, right? Just because we are making the wrong assumptions about how others think. And I think that's one of the keys where it's not easy to change that, of course, right? But I think that's one of the angles that are actually many of the gender empowerment organizations, local ones, but also international ones, that try to I want to say play with these norms, because it is a form of social engineering, especially when it is done by Western organizations that believe they can go to contexts that are, in the global south and and bring development to these communities. I think it is of course well intended, but also highly problematic, right? And it often doesn't work actually, right? So there are plenty of studies. I've been part of impact evaluations where we found that these type of programs, providing counseling to women, raising awareness of women's rights, empowering women also economically through trainings, they backfire sometimes, right? So the response is that men take it out on the women, which is clearly completely opposing to the objectives of such programs. And I think this is partly due to the problem that, well, men feel that they lose power, that this is a zero-sum game at the end of the day. I think you can't ignore the men in these situations, right? So it is not to excuse men at all, right? But I think it's just very important to see this as a very complex social context, as it usually is, and not come with these surgical interventions that try to make a quick fix in a 4-year development program, how it is very often implemented these days. Yeah.
Thank you. And then we will very soon come back to this part of the solutions and what we need for the solutions. But before we do that, I want to pick up a question we have in the chat, which is addressed to Marcella. And the question is, who are the perpetrators of forced disappearance? Who are those actors? Who and what are they doing? Are they is it human trafficking? I have to translate, I'm sorry. Is it human trafficking, and are they selling off the girls to other countries, or what is it that is happening there?
Yes, so it is hard to answer because it depends on the regions, but it is started like the root causes of this phenomena or problematic issue in Mexico is because of the militarization of public security. So the minute that the military forces, without actually recognizing an internal non-international armed conflict, as some organizations are trying to put that now, the minute that the military forces started to attack or declare a war, a non-existent war on cartels, that is when the violence started. And it's because of this violence and the war and the drug policy that is not actually regulating the main causes of violence, and mostly thinking of the problem as a thing between armed forces and organized groups. So a lot of organized groups actually started to fragment each other and actually diversify each other. So a lot of the perpetrators are the criminal groups, like the cartels. In Mexico, the cartels increased exponentially since this so-called war on drugs, and the cartels are one of the perpetrators, and of course they are not acting by themselves. They are in collusion with the authorities, local authorities like police forces, or even political parties in different contexts, of course. And of course the armed forces are also by doing a lot of human rights violations, including enforced disappearances. So the thing with the armed forces is that because of the nature of national security, the information is very low. So we have a lot of cases, documented cases, where armed forces participated in enforced disappearances alongside the cartels or the organized crime, including, for example, the very like a case that was in every media in the last years, which is the disappearance of the 43 students in Mexico. So like these, a lot of cases were also perpetrated by these cartels, and because of the impunity and the lack of capacities among the state. The percentage of impunity is more than 95% in Mexico of impunity on those cases. So of course it's hard to actually address these causes of violence and disappearances. And yeah, I just wanted to add a little bit on what Julia and Carlos said on these causes of the violence, which is of course the sexism and the machismo, but as an organization in Mexico, Intersecta says this is not only trying to deal with the war against women, which is this machismo and sexism, but it's also the war on drugs that by putting the military strategies implemented on the state on its name, reinforce the idea of use of force, of violence, therefore more weapons coming from the United States, more drug crisis not being attended as a healthy issue with a human rights perspective, but also there is no intention to guarantee women's lives and rights.
Thank you so much. And Marcela, you just pointed out that that many of those disappearances and of the violence are the result of the militarized approach in the war on drugs. What are alternatives to this approach addressing organized crime and the disappearance crisis in Mexico?
There have been several studies locally made of what has worked, for example, in the north of Mexico with the Zetas cartel, which are actually former military forces who formed this huge cartel. They started to work with the community at the same time that they went for the money, right? Like, of course, the money that the cartels move is huge, and there should be some sort of an intelligence behind that, and the prevention, of course, of these crimes, and because of the context of the social context that made usually the teenagers, men, victims of recruiting by the cartels. They have to go and address those problems, right? But for instance, better conditions for men in education, in employment, etc. Of course, the judiciary system, it has to be attended, and at the same time, not only looking at the justice in a criminal way, right, like criminal justice, but also some other forms of justice, like transitional justice, which mean a form of like going through address the truth, the memory of those crimes, and also lead to measures of reparation and non-repetition. And I mean, at least for my side and on what I have studied, the policy on drugs, it is very like urgent in Mexico, not only because the drugs are going through the states, but also because it's staying in Mexico in the most vulnerable communities. So without a drug policy based on human rights and looking at the problem as a health issue, the thinking of using only armed forces is going to keep us in the same direction that we have lived in the last 16 years.
Thank you. Julia, in your work, you found that women leaders are very affected by threats, especially sexualized threats of violence, but also by femicides and murders, especially in Colombia. How do you explain that these women nonetheless are willing to organize, to mobilize, and to engage and help other women of be civil active?
That's a great question, and the question which shaped my PhD and my work to date. One of the things that really came out of my PhD research, but going forward to the work that I'm doing in El Salvador with other kinds of women leaders, and in Mexico with, again, other kinds of, some of them would consider themselves women leaders, others perhaps activists, others peace builders, others simply mothers who are looking for their children, is that in contexts impacted and shaped by consistent and chronic violence, it's not as though keeping your head down and not acting in any way necessarily guarantees your safety. And so because there's this ongoing risk of any kind of violence, again, in these contexts of armed conflict or militarization, as Marcela was just speaking about, or, gang control, or now, I don't know if you can hear me, but my camera's just gone off. Okay, you can hear me, great. Or now in the Bukele administration in El Salvador, this, extreme mano dura domestic security policy. Women know that, again, because of all of these reasons we've spoken about during this conversation, that they're at risk anyway. And so the potential benefits of mobilizing, which go beyond just achieving the principal goal of, for example, arriving at some kind of peace, or finding your missing child, or, being able to protect the environmental area that you're trying to save. Beyond that, there are additional benefits that go with this mobilization. So feelings of solidarity, psychosocial benefits, the ability to talk to others, connect, to have some kind of space to share these different violences that have happened, process them, heal from them, when perhaps more Western or traditional psychological services are not available. Also the ability to get project funding, to form an organization, to get support from transnational advocacy networks, or from foreign governments, or from foreign INGOs. All of these potential benefits come together and provide a sense of meaning, a sense of collective identity, and a motivation to continue to participate despite the risks that are present. And I will shamelessly plug that I go into much more detail in this in my book. So that's kind of the place that I've really expounded on this in much more detail. But I would say that beyond Colombia, which the book is about, I do see these similar patterns here with the Madres Buscadoras, in El Salvador with feminist mobilizers, here in Mexico with, for example, I've done work with Indigenous women who are trying to prevent gender-based violence in their communities in Guerrero, which is a state which has, suffered so many of the effects that Marcela was talking about in terms of militarization in the context of the war on drugs. And so all of these places, there are perhaps not face value. It is risky to involve yourself in these activities where you expose yourself in a public way, but the benefits do begin to outweigh some of those costs when non-mobilization isn't a guarantee of safety in the first place.
Thank you. Carlo, maybe you want to come in here as well, because in one of your articles I read, survivors of sexual violence are 16 to 31% more likely to be active members in community-based associations. So maybe you can explain a little bit this finding, and in which countries you have this finding, and which kind of community-based associations they are. So are they addressing the problem of gender-based violence?
You called me on cold feet now. I don't really know for which country this was, but maybe it was of a more recent article. So when we collected this data, so I did a research project that was interested in the social and political consequences of sexual violence in war. And the reason for that was that when I finished my PhD, there was this new research literature emerging that found that people who experience violence in wars, right, become more pro-social, they become more engaged in their communities, they become more interested, more likely to take over leadership roles, and so on and so on. But then there was all this literature and advocacy on sexual violence in conflict, which of course is much more, the focus was on stigmatization, on social exclusion, on marginalization of survivors, in particular women, but also men, right? And I thought, how do these two things get together, actually, right? That doesn't seem to be the one literature ignored sexual violence as a very common form. So that was the motivation for this project that has been going on for the past years. And then we looked how sexual violence basically correlates with forms of mobilization, and found surprisingly that it is, but not surprising, it is associated with stigmatization. That's what basically the psychological literature suggests, but that it is also associated with a higher level of mobilization in literature. So people are more likely to be either members, but also leaders of local associations like a school committee, health committee, a farmers association, a women's group, all these kind of local small scale associations in rural areas that are, not necessarily very prestigious, but they are really important for the functioning of local communities, because in many of these places, the state doesn't provide any services, right? No education, no health services, no access to water, no security, no justice. So all these little services that we take for granted actually are often locally produced through community members and of course, local elites within these communities. The downside of that is actually, now you would think, okay, maybe there is an upside, and that speaks to this, okay, that there is this mobilization, at least in response to sexual violence. But what we found is that it's not the women who get more engaged, it's the men. So if I, as a husband, as my wife would be raped by an armed group, the data suggests that I would be more engaged. It's not the women who are, so the gender gap doesn't close of being more present and represented in the public. It's still more the men that are doing that, right? And so it's, in our thinking, this is not necessarily a sign of empowerment. It's more a sign of social compensation, to compensate for the face loss, for the stigma, for to try to get back accepted in the community. And there is actually quite a lot of evidence in the social psychology literature for precisely this mechanism, not related to sexual violence, but our innate desire to remain part of our social reference group, in particular, if we have to rely on it for survival, right? So that might be very different in Europe or in the global north, where you have institutions that you can draw to, support that you can get from those, right? Yeah, so it sounds like a kind of optimistic by-effect, if we can say that, but not necessarily for the benefit of women. So that's yeah, you're right. Okay.
And there is a comment or part of a comment in the chat that reads kind of it's every single person's responsibility to protect women and treat them well. So this adds to this idea of community engagement, but also, and that's very good to know finally, is the responsibility of the state actors, but also foreign actors. So what is being done on the state level in the countries that you've been studying, and what is being done by non-state foreign actors, and where are the challenges they face? And I pose this question now to all three of you, because we have time constraints and already have to get a bit towards the end. So maybe Marcela, you want to start, and then we go through the round?
Sure. I think at least in Latin America, the idea of militarization of public security started, of course, it's not long time ago, not only 16 years ago, with the pressure of the United States to actually start a kingpin strategy, first in Colombia, and actually in Colombia kind of like worked out differently, also in Peru, but in Mexico, it did not work out at all. So the kingpin strategy is basically capture the heads of the drug cartels, and yeah, while they were captured, of course, delivered to the justice, whether in the country or to the United States, right? And also the weapons, the trafficking of weapons between these two countries, it has been really hard to actually handle. It's more than 10 million weapons that had been trafficking to Mexico, also, like not only from the United States but also from Germany, for example. And those weapons are the ones that have been used for killings and that are actually used by the military forces, but not only, but also for the criminal by the criminal forces. So what I would say is that, of course, there's a lot of opportunities to address here, starting on this relationship between states and also look at other countries where the different strategies actually worked. I think Colombia, it's also a reference, at least for Mexico, what happened on the armed conflict and the ways to solve it. But there's a lot of ideas in different countries that we can also look at in Africa or Asia. And I think I will close here my comment because of time strings. Thank you.
I'm happy to jump in now. I think, my ears perk up when I hear what you just said, Desiree, about, we all need to protect women. And I agree with the sentiment, but I would also say that framing women, as we kind of have in many ways throughout this conversation, as vulnerable, as victims, as powerless, as those bodies that experience violence, doesn't show the whole picture. That absolutely is part of it, but also, so often in the world of GBV, we don't talk about victims, we talk about survivors. We talk about people who have gone through and survived. In the case of victims of femicide, no, because they didn't survive. And so I think we can hold that ethos around, it absolutely being everyone's kind of responsibility to engage in kind of violence prevention and violence response. I would also say that to go to your question, there are so many thousands of incredibly empowered women's organizations at the grassroots, at national levels, engaging in transnational activism, who have for decades been pushing for gender justice agendas. And so in terms of what should be done, beyond what Marcela said, which I absolutely agree with in terms of thinking about the gendered impacts of different security policies, we should be listening to, engaging with, funding, and supporting with other resources these women's organizations and LGBTIQ plus organizations as well, operating in their home contexts, who have the most accurate understanding of the security situation, who often have the most accurate understanding of what needs to be done. So I think beyond top-down solutions, very much looking at bottom-up solutions and focusing on women's empowerment and women's ability to engage as agentic actors, even in and even against conditions which put them in vulnerable situations. So kind of all of the different patterns we've spoken about around gender-based violence.
Thank you, Julia. Carlo.
Yeah, I think, Marcela and Julia made the main points. There's not much that I want to contribute here on top of that. I think for me also a strong point is to say, I often hear that, this idea that it's the patriarchy, it's the social norms that men hold. And I think there is there's just much more variation than we that we miss if we use these blanket statements, right? So it's not all men, even in those contexts, hold these same views. I mean, there are fantastic qualitative articles that show how men suffer through in parallel with their wives when they have been raped, right? And how they struggle because they feel they now need to reject their wives because that's kind of expected from their peers, right? So and that I miss this nuance often in these conversations, which I think is really beneficial to bring in, because as I said before, and there is quite a lot of evidence that many of these women's empowerment programs just backfire, right? And that's definitely an unintended, really negative consequence. Of course, women's empowerment programs, they build on this idea that you want to challenge the social norms, right? So there is, of course, tension there. That's the whole idea of it. But I think you need to reduce the risk to those that are supposed to be benefiting from it, right? And I think that's where human rights organizations, development organizations, humanitarian aid organizations, and all those really need to learn much, much more. And where research such as Julia and Marcella are doing it, including myself here too, right, and many, many others, is really important to bring this in more collaboration. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And I would like to point out that Julia has just posted some good resources on this topic, especially on the topic of empowerment programs and the problematic aspects of empowerment programs. And also Carlo has earlier pointed out that there is still a lot of space for more research on empowerment, women's empowerment, or empowerment programs in general, a lot of need for research. So I hope we will have a future conversation on that at another point. I would have like a million more questions, but unfortunately time is up, and I was briefed that it's very strict, so we have to close here, unfortunately. Thank you so much to all three of you. Thank you for all the guests. I know there were some questions in the chat that we could not answer. Some questions have been answered directly in the chat by Carlo, for example, as well, pointing out some data sources. So have a look there. And if you enjoyed this or are interested in another session, you can also join us next for next Giga Forum on the 3rd of April, which is on the Gaza war and its impacts on the Middle East. You can register via our homepage, and also you can sign up in our newsletter to stay informed about similar events. Thank you all for being here, for having joined us tonight, and have a nice evening.